Welcome to this IUN Community Garden Session, Pollinator Gardening for Small Spaces. The presenter for today's session is Dolly Foster. Dolly, landscape horticulturist, has been a master gardener for 22 years, an Indiana Accredited Horticulturist for 20, and a certified arborist since 2008. For the past 22 years, Dolly has been presenting lectures on many gardening topics. She spent several years as an adjunct faculty member in the Joliet Junior College Agriculture Horticulture Department and 18 years in the Parks and Recreation industry as staff horticulturist for 2 park districts. Dolly has managed the Oak Lawn Community Garden. Dolly has been butterfly gardening from the very beginning of her gardening career. Her passion has led her to raising monarch and swallowtail butterflies, which she has done for the past 15 years. Her garden at home has been a monarch way station since 2011. Welcome, Dolly.
Hello, everybody. Okay, we are going to go through a lot of information tonight. First, I would like to go through the different kinds of pollinators that there are that we see in our gardens when we have lots of pollinators. There's so many different pollinators. There's hundreds of thousands of insects in the world, and we have our very own subset in our region, and most of them are pollinators. Not all of them, but a lot of them are pollinators. I don't want to say most, but what we have to understand about pollinators is that they are a very, very diverse group. And when you are planning your pollinator garden, you want to be able to make your garden a diverse garden in order to bring in the diverse group of pollinators, similar to what you see on the screen. So what we have on the screen up on the top right-hand side is a mason bee. And that mason bee looks like she is setting up to start nesting in a little tube nest that somebody provided for her. And we have a hummingbird next to that mason bee. Eastern bumblebees. This is the species of bumblebee that we see in this region. And it's an eastern bumblebee because it has a black dot on its back. And then next to that is a hoverfly. And that hoverfly is indeed a fly. It's not a bee. It looks like a bee to make it look menacing. And so other insects won't try to eat it. But if you pay attention and look at that photograph really closely, you can see that its eyes are actually fly eyes. And there are many, many mimic flies out there that make themselves look like bees, but you can always tell that they're flies based on the eyes. They have very, very big eyes. We have a monarch butterfly down there. She's going to represent the fact that we have about 96 to 110 species of butterflies in the Chicagoland region, which we are part of the Chicagoland region, despite what Chicago says. And then we have a honeybee next to her and a hummingbird moth next to that. That's a clear wing hummingbird moth. If you've never seen a hummingbird moth before, they are really, really fun to watch. They look like a hummingbird. They act like a hummingbird. They have a big long tongue like a hummingbird. They hover like a hummingbird, but it is an insect. So they're fascinating to watch. Down on the bottom right-hand side, we have a bat. That's a fruit bat, and fruit bats are pollinators. They're not like huge pollinators here in our area, but they are very important pollinators in the tropics and in other regions of North America. But the tropics are where they really shine as a pollinator. And then next to that is a soldier beetle. And that soldier beetle there is just kind of holding the spot of all the soft body beetles that we have in this area, which includes lightning bugs. So they're kind of different than hard shell beetles. They're obviously their shells are soft and not hard. They don't fly as well as the other kinds of beetles. What else can I tell you about them? There's a lot of them out there. There is a ton of soft-bodied beetles out there. And this is just one that you're going to see. And then, like I said, lightning bugs also fall into this category. Next to that little beetle is a fly. And that's just a common house fly. And then down on the bottom right in the corner is a green sweat bee. And so the wonderful thing about bees is that we think of, I don't know about you, but when I used to think about bees in our region, I would think about 3 types of bees. There's honeybees, there's yellow jackets, and there's bumblebees. And I think for most people, most gardeners, that's kind of what everybody runs into, is those 3 types of bees. But you have to understand that there's 400 species of native bees in Indiana. And the better your pollinator garden is, the more of those species that you're going to see. And most of them, in fact, the vast majority of them, are very friendly. They are not out to sting you. So let's talk about what makes a really good pollinator. What makes an insect a pollinator? Well, first of all, a pollinator has to be a highly mobile little individual. They have to be able to fly from flower to flower, because that is the whole nature of pollination. Pollination is the movement of pollen from one flower to another flower. And what it does is it is the male part of a flower, and it's going to fertilize the female part of a flower. And the result is a fruit with a seed inside. And pollen can attach to hairs and scales and feathers on insects and hummingbirds. And that's how it's transported. So when you see a bee, let's see, is our bee covered with? I have a photograph coming up with, I think, with a bee covered with pollen, so we can show you that. But bees are pretty hairy, and bumblebees are pretty hairy, and so they can carry pollen very easily. Insects that are good pollinators and other creatures that are good pollinators are adapted to feeding on the specific flowers that they have evolved with. So that means that they are able to drink the nectar. They have a long tongue or a short tongue. Those are 2 categories of bees: long tongue bees, short tongue bees. And that means that they are only going to feed off of certain flowers that have short nectaries or long nectaries. Good pollinators will have specialized feeding structures and habits. So they're going to have the right mouth parts, and they're going to have the right habits to get out there and pollinate, the plants that they're supposed to, when they're supposed to. The flowers really trigger that process by opening and releasing their scent and attracting the bees. So that it's kind of a symbiotic thing. They're going to visit a limited number of plant species. And for bees, this is kind of important because when we see honey on a shelf in a store, oftentimes you see honey that's a lot of different colors. And that means that the bees that made that honey, maybe if it's really, really crystal clear, like yellow honey, that means it's late summer goldenrod honey. More of a darker gold is going to be something like clover honey. Blueberry honey is purple. So for honeybees, they're gonna only nectar from what's blooming around them at that time. And so, I mean, for honeybees, beekeepers are going to travel those bees around and have them feeding on what they want them to feed on. But it's the same with native bees and other pollinators out there. They're going to just feed on usually one type of plant a day, but that's not for that is not a strict rule for everybody, but it's sort of a general rule that they're going to feed on one type of plant per day. So let's talk a little bit about bee facts. There's 400 species of bees in Indiana and also in Illinois. There's 4,000 species of bees all over the United States and North America. And worldwide, we have 20,000 species of bees. Those 20,000 species of bees include wasps. Wasps are considered a type of bee. So there's lots of different kinds of bees out there. They come in all different colors and shapes and sizes. I mean, there are blue bees, mason bees, some of them are blue. There's green bees, there's white bees, there's black and white striped bees. There's black wasps, there's yellow and black wasps. So there's a lot of variety, a lot more variety than you think about if you are new to this and you've only ever seen yellow jackets, honeybees, and bumblebees. So it kind of, this is going to just give you a small taste of the fact that there's so much variety and diversity out there in the insect world. A little bit about honeybees. Honeybees, if you don't know, honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought over during colonial times from Europe. They only range about 1 mile from their hive in order to feed. And it's very strict for honeybees that they do only feed on one type of flower per day. It's kind of an interesting thing that they do. They live in managed hives. They are considered livestock in the United States. They are moved around according to what crops are blooming at one time or another. It's a big thing in California. It's a big thing for the blueberry industry. It's a big thing for the almond industry, and a couple of other fruit industries. They can also live in wild hives though. So down in the southern states, it's a lot more common for beekeepers to run into or get calls about a swarm of bees, because they can live outdoors over the winter-ish. They don't have as cold winters like in the southern parts of the Gulf states and things like that. So having them live out in wild hives is a little bit more common than we would have here, unless it's in a really deep hole in a tree. I think that's probably one of the places that they would do it around here. Honeybees, again, they're very important to agriculture. Honeybees are the reason why we are able to have about 90% of our food, because they pollinate the flowers of those food plants. And so if the honeybee populations collapsed, we'd be in really big trouble. Native bees are better pollinators, they're more efficient pollinators, and they're faster pollinators. However, they just don't pollinate our food plants because I don't think there's enough of them. Whereas if a farmer is bringing in hives for, say, his blueberry farm or his almond farm, there will be tens of millions of bees. And I just don't think there's enough native bees to keep up with agriculture. But they are better, one-to-one, they are better pollinators. So honeybees, one more fact about them is they're the only bees in North America that produce honey. African bees do produce honey in the continent of Africa. And that is why African bees came over here to the US, for them to try and hybridize those together, European and African. And that's kind of how we ended up with Africanized bees, which have not been seen in Indiana yet. So don't get too nervous about that. So native bees, they're going to have two different life habits. They are going to live either in the cavities of plants, that they are going to dig through the stems of a plant to make a little nest. And 70% of those bees are, and the bees that live in cavities of plants, they are solitary. The ones that will dig down and make a nest in the ground are usually really small colonies. It's nothing like a honeybee colony. An average honeybee hive will have 30 to 70,000 bees. They're very large colonies, and they're very well organized. Smaller bees, native bees, they're going to make nests in the ground. You'll see a hole in the ground. If you really want to nurture native bees and bumblebees, you have to have bare dirt somewhere on your property in order for them to be able to dig down. And that's 70% of them. So it's the vast majority are going to live in the ground. So another thing about native bees that I find really fascinating is that they rarely sting. Now, I have gotten stung by a bumblebee, but that was because I disturbed her nest. In fact, it's happened to me twice. I've gotten hit twice by a bumblebee. And it was because I accidentally disturbed their nest. I, turned it over. They were in something else that they shouldn't have been in. They weren't in the ground. And this is kind of normal for bumblebees. They sometimes will put their nest in a very quiet place, like in a flower pot that's overturned, things like that. That doesn't mean that you can't go out there and put flower pots upside down in your garden to make a toad house, because they're not automatically going to go to that. So don't think that's a true thing. They do it, it's just not very common. All of our native bees do not make honey. They do feed their young pollen. So it's really important to have pollen-rich plants in your garden in order to accommodate them. And native bees can pollinate better than honeybees, which I already said. Okay, some more bee facts. This photograph in here is a really cool photo of a bee that is making a nest inside of a stem of something, and it looks like this is probably in a homemade bee house that someone cut stems from their garden and actually put into a little bee house because there's more than one of them around there. But they actually do dig down in these things and they'll clean all the pith out. If you're not using bamboo, they have to clean it out and make a space for their eggs and their food to put in there, and then they seal them in chambers. And I do have a picture later on in this talk where I'm going to show you that. So the feeding range of native bees is very limited. And I think this is why they have not spread very much to where we can see thousands of them. This is because of fragmentation of their habitat. We have eliminated and converted millions and millions of acres of natural areas into suburban sprawl, into industry, and everything else that has to do with human civilization. And what that has done by fragmentizing, it has taken away habitat that the bees need in order to be able to move around in a region. Because most of these small bees, some of these little wasps, I don't know if you can see this. You guys might not be able to see this, but you can see, if you can see my fingers, they're very, very small. Some of these little native wasps are really, really small. And when they come out in the morning from their nest underground and they are going to feed, the smallest ones will only feed within 50 yards of their nest. That's a half of a football field. So that's probably, I'm looking at my window right now. That's probably like half a block, maybe a whole block away from their nest. So it's not far. So if we have too much fragmentation in natural habitats, that means that that species of bee is probably going to kind of be trapped within that small space that they can get out and reach for feeding. But if we have more gardens in more places throughout a neighborhood, that means that that bee can slowly move, like her daughters can move on to the next yard and make a nest, and then and make more of those bees. And then the year after, those daughter bees can go on and move on to the next yard, and they can make more bees and move around, and the population eventually can replenish. So I want you to think about, your neighborhood, okay? Think about your town and think about your neighborhood. Just do that for a second. Your town is a lake. Around the lake is habitat that is broken up by industry and other towns, but there is a little bit of habitat. Okay, do you have that visualized? What I want you to think about is your neighborhood and your garden within that neighborhood being small islands and lily pads in this lake. Your neighborhood is an island that can either be very, very nurturing to nature and very beneficial to nature, or that island, your neighborhood, could be a desert to pollinators, to small wildlife, and to birds, songbirds specifically. Your lily pad, your house, your garden could be a very, very rich habitat. But if you are the only lily pad that is attached to that island, then there's not a lot of habitat there. And those little bees that can only fly 50 yards away from their lily pad where they were born, if they can only fly 50 yards and 50 yards away is an island that is a desert, then they are going to have a really hard time propagating their species. So what we need to do is encourage people by planting pollinator gardens, planting wildlife habitat, getting certified as wildlife habitat gardens, and get the word out to our neighbors and start making more lily pad gardens. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about that, write your question in the chat and we will talk about it as a group at the end, because I think we have a small enough group that we could do that. So with the smallest bees only ranging about 50 yards from their nest, that means that the bigger bees can go a little bit farther, a little bit farther, and a little bit farther. And so something like a bumblebee or a carpenter bee is going to be able to range pretty far. So I'm not going to say that those populations are doing okay. I'm just saying that they can look for food farther away from their nest and actually be able to make it back before dark so they don't die overnight. So I hope that makes sense. So think about being a lily pad. Manifest it. All right, let's talk about some butterfly facts. There's about 110 species in the Chicagoland region. Our favorite is the monarch. We all know that. We love our monarchs in this area. They're not the best pollinators though. Butterflies are great, and but they're not great pollinators. They're not like a bee. They're not the best like a bee. However, butterflies are a species that is really vulnerable. So when butterflies disappear from an area, that means that something has drastically gone wrong in the environment, and we need to pay attention. It's the same way with a wooded area or a wetland, that when amphibians start reducing in population and disappear, there's something drastically wrong with the land where those amphibians formerly lived. And so it's the same with butterflies. If butterflies really start declining and we stop seeing butterflies, that's a big problem. One example of this is that when I first moved into my house, I live probably a half a block from a park, and there were big willow trees in that park. Well, after we had been living here for a long time, I started butterfly gardening, and I started seeing mourning cloaks, and I saw viceroy butterflies, and both of those butterflies lay their eggs in willow trees. We had a very, very big storm come through. I think it was in 2008. And I think just about every willow tree in the park got knocked down. And because of that, there is nowhere for mourning cloaks and viceroy butterflies had to lay their eggs. I haven't seen either of those butterflies in a really, really long time. So that's like 13 years ago. Very, very rarely will I see either of those butterflies. And I mean rarely, like maybe I've seen a few mourning cloaks in the last 13 years, but I do not believe I've seen any viceroy. So it's very impactful when things like that happen. Now the city has come out. They have planted new native trees all over our park. They planted about 75. We have about 70 that survived. And so hopefully in the decades that come, those butterflies will be able to return. But because we lost their keystone species, the willow tree, they disappeared. All right, so each species of butterfly likes their own flowers. They have their favorites. So if you want to learn more about attracting butterflies to your garden, that can be an avenue of research for you to go out and read about. Their favorite colors are purple, pink, red, orange, and yellow, which seems like all the colors in the rainbow, but there are a couple of things that are missing. Red is not on this list. Red is generally the favorite color of hummingbirds, and blue is not on this list. That is generally the favorite color of bees. And white is not on this list because that is generally a bee color. White, pale pink, things like that. That doesn't mean that you're never going to see a butterfly on a Shasta daisy or a white coneflower, but these other colors are definitely their favorite. Make sure when you are planning out and planting this pollinator garden that you have made sure that you have host plants for the butterflies, for the caterpillars. So if you're interested in monarchs, make sure you have milkweed. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 species tonight. And then if you are interested in swallowtail butterflies, make sure you have dill, parsley, and zizia, which is golden Alexanders. That is the native host for the black swallowtail. So why should we be concerned? I talked a little bit already about our lake and island and lily pad metaphor. Copyright. Why should we be concerned about this? Well, again, our food system is based on pollinators. It is based on the honeybee. And this is 90% of our food. So if you have ever not seen it, look up the photo online of the day that Whole Foods took everything out of their flagship store. They took everything out of the produce area that is pollinated to be produced, and it was nearly empty. It's a very, very impactful photograph to really drive home the fact that we need pollinators, we need healthy honeybees, even though they're not native, we still need them, but we also still need our native wild bees, because our native bees are what keeps the flower cycle going. And if we do not have the flower cycle going, then our native areas start to die off. If we lose our native trees, if we lose our native shrubs, we lose our native flowers, then we start having things like erosion and bare soil and invasive species move in. There is a lot of just a lot of dominoes that fall if we lose things like pollinators. Okay, pollinators provide a lot of pollination services, and I'm not going to go through all that today, but just a couple of pollination eco services that pollinators do is the results of their jobs are better plants, clean water, clean air, erosion control, and clean water going into the aquifer. And that's a very, very brief list. An ecosystem is, I'm going to read the definition that I just found from a researcher that I met that I really like. So there's the one on the screen and then this one. Ecosystems are dynamic patterns of process or relationship between the environment and the organisms that live in it. Okay. And so that means that every organism that lives out in an environment has a relationship with the environment has a relationship with it, the environment has a relationship with another pollinator or another insect or another small creature, and so they're all tied together. And when it's healthy, it's like having a really good immune system. Everything is working like a really well-tooled machine, and that means that we will see, just as humans, just sort of on the surface, kind of, we will see really amazing things in our gardens when we have a healthy ecosystem in the garden. Now, when we're thinking about designing a garden, we want to think about also building habitat. And so building habitat, over a few years, you will start seeing ecosystem signs. And I'm going to talk about that at the end. What are the signs of an ecosystem? So what's habitat? Habitat is the natural environment where an organism like pollinators lives and where it can find the resources it needs to live, including food, shelter, resting place, and mating places, and places to lay their eggs. So those are the 4 things that you need to think about when you're planning a pollinator garden. Do you have food for the adult pollinators? Meaning, do you have food for the native bees? Do you have food for bumblebees? Do you have food for butterflies? Do you have food for hummingbirds? Whatever you are trying to attract to the garden. And I'm not going to say you should, but you need to think about all of the insects and all the small creatures that are going to be feeding from flowers, and trying to accommodate a little bit for all of them is a good thing, I think. You need shelter, so having a couple of big thick shrubs around, having an evergreen tree somewhere on your property is good. So that's shelter and resting places, mating places, and then some place to lay their eggs. So you need to have host plants. A habitat is more than just a flower garden. So a flower garden is, or a pollinator garden, is really kind of where everything starts when we're in the planning process. Great, we have beds laid out, we have drawings, we have names of plants, we have sources for those plants, we have the plants, we've planted the plants, we see no insects, we see no pollinators. It's because we need food, we need some more shelter, we need host plants, and then also water. So you need to have a source of water somewhere. I'm lucky enough to be right next to the Little Calumet River, so that really does kind of act as our water source. And we have a vernal pond in our park, which used to be an ice skating rink. It was an outdoor ice skating rink for years, and now it floods every winter, And in the spring, it's a vernal pond. And that's where the thousands and thousands of toads in our neighborhood go to spawn every year. It's really kind of funny. And then by the end of June, that pond is all dried up. It's kind of fun. It's a totally unplanned thing. Trees and shrubs offer food in the form of flowers and fruit and foliage for the caterpillars. So you have to think of trees as more than just, what can the trees do for my eyes? How can trees please the entire environment, all of the creatures in my environment, not just me? All right, providing some habitat. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about that. Plant with diversity in mind. You look at this photo of my garden. It is a very diverse garden. I don't even know how many species I have, but I do know there's like 28 or 30 in this photo because I was at a garden club one night and they made me count. They wanted to know. But there's a lot in here, and there's a mixture of native and non-native in my garden, and that's okay to have. It's okay to have both. I don't think that the average Joe in your neighborhood who is really into having a nice lawn and manicured landscaping is going to appreciate a big fluffy mess of beautiful pollinator garden right off the bat, you know, and neighbors matter. Neighbors do matter when you're doing something like this in the front yard. They can get quite offended if you don't have the formal landscaping that they do. So having good diversity and having good communication with your neighbors can help mitigate things like that. And people do get harassed on the regular in cities all over the country for having taken up their front yards and putting in pollinator gardens, prairie lawns, things like that. And communication with your neighbors is extremely important. So if you register your garden with an organization, make sure that you buy the sign. I really encourage you to do that. All right, some steps to building a perennial garden or pollinator garden. Make sure that you have perennials from your region. So a good way to do that is to delve into organizations like Wild Ones. Join the local Wild Ones organization. We have one here in Northwest Indiana. It's the first one that was ever chartered in the state of Indiana, and it's called Gibson Woods Wild Ones, and we're in Hammond here. And the other one is in South Bend. Add annuals and herbs for diversity. So you can put them in the ground, you can put them in pots, you know, you can arrange it however you want to, but it's okay to add annuals in. In fact, when I first started butterfly gardening, I didn't understand why I didn't see butterflies. Well, I was informed when I started going to Wild Ones meetings that I needed to have things that were native that the butterflies would recognize, and it made more sense. And so things started clicking in my mind. I started doing a lot of readings, going to a lot of meetings, attending lectures, things like that. And I noticed that if I wanted monarchs in the yard and I wanted caterpillars, I wanted to see caterpillars, well, I have to have things like swamp milkweed and common milkweed. Had to have it. And so I started changing my idea about my butterfly garden and what it is to have a butterfly garden. But then after a few years, I realized I really wasn't seeing that many butterflies and I didn't understand what was going on. And what was going on was that I didn't have really big flashy annuals like zinnias and Mexican sunflower and tall verbena to really attract them in. Like having those kind of annuals that are kind of big and flashy is like having a neon sign over your garden that says, come here and eat here because we have the food. And that gets them to come in, they see it, they come down your garden, and then the native plants are there for them and they hang around your garden a little bit longer. You can have a pollinator garden in containers. I would specifically say the bigger the container, the better. Even something like half whiskey barrels and even bigger than that. What is very, very popular right now are the corrugated steel flower beds that people are using for vegetable gardens. I bought 2 of those for my house to plant just my pollinator annuals in. So instead of potting up like 30 different small flower pots all over my property, that really and truly is a nightmare to try and water every single day, I am going to concentrate my pollinator annuals in 2 beds that are going to be 8 feet long. And so therefore, I will have only 2 spots to water. It will save me some time, and it will keep my house and my very, very limited amount of space that I have a little bit cleaner and easier to walk around. So other things to add to your garden to build pollinator habitat, add a water element, and a solar bubbler or a little solar waterfall is the perfect thing. It's very unassuming. It's not threatening. It's not deep water. You can do the same thing with a, you can put a solar bubbler in a bird bath. And you can also do things like add marbles to a big saucer and put that out for bees. Bees and other pollinators like hummingbirds, they actually do like to take baths, but things like butterflies, they don't like having any kind of depth of water to have to step their little feet into because they're afraid they're getting drowned. So it has to be very shallow. Moving water is excellent for hummingbirds. They love moving water. And there is definitely things out there on the internet to read about that. And there's lots of books about hummingbirds and how to build habitat for them. Plant as diversely as you can. So if you have limited space, what we're going to talk about today are compact plants that you can plant to make a diverse garden and sort of maximize your space as much as possible. And then you want to think about planting in drifts, which means planting your plants in kind of a big clump instead of just having one of a plant. Try and have 3. You can try and plant vertically. So you can have vines in there in your garden. If you have limited space, do not even think about having trumpet vine. That will be a forever plant that you don't want. Include places to raise young. So if you're interested in monarchs and black swallowtails, you want to add in milkweed and you want to add in things like parsley and golden Alexander, and that will make them happy. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of other plants that are host plants tonight. Avoid landscaping fabric and avoid using river rock, because the whole point of having a pollinator garden is having a place for native bees to nest. And for that to happen, you have to have bare soil. And then delay your spring cleanup because that is important. And I'm going to tell you why a little bit later. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I read everything I needed to tell you right now. All right, let's move on. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about spring cleanup at the end. Design elements. So a few things to think about when you're actually choosing your plants and arranging them on a drawing or in a chart or however you're going to do it. Plan for a continuous bloom of flowers from April to October. So that means you kind of have to do some research. You want to have at least 3 species of plants blooming in each part of the spring, summer, and fall. So spring bloomers, and then early summer, kind of midsummer, and then late summer and fall. So you sort of have 4 sections of the season that you need to pay attention to, because there are definitely groups of species of native plants that bloom early summer, and there are definitely some that bloom mid to late summer, and the tween shall never meet. They really don't cross over. There's not a lot of crossover with some of these. Plant a variety of colors and shapes of flowers. Try to avoid double or multiple petaled plants. Oh God, say that 5 times. So don't put in peonies that have like 1,000 petals, because peonies are popular with bumblebees, but it has to be open peony. So think of an open face sandwich rather than a sandwich with a top, a bottom, and saran wrap and tin foil around it and wrapped in wax paper and then put into a paper bag. That's kind of what that kind of big fluffy plants with lots and lots of petals are to them. What you want is a plant that has the simplest flowers possible so that it is easier to get to the nectar and the pollen. Planting groups instead of repeating patterns. So instead of having like coneflower, liatris, and baptisia, coneflower, liatris, baptisia, coneflower, liatris, baptisia, have baptisia liatris, all of them together, and all of your coneflower together. So you're designing more for making it accommodating to the pollinators instead of making a design, again, that's pleasing to you. This garden is not about you. It's about the pollinators that you're trying to feed. I guess it seems like a kind of a harsh thing to say, but it really is true. It's not about these anymore. It's about them and what they need to eat. So that's sort of the philosophy that I have had in my garden. It has not steered me wrong yet. So, although I do still need my garden to be pleasing to me and have beautiful flowers and have something blooming all the time, but I really don't stylize my garden very well, or at all. If any of you have ever seen my garden, a couple of you have, looking at the list. And then make sure that when you do plan out your garden, that you don't just have one of each plant. Make sure you have about 3 of each plant. If you have limited space, it might limit how many species you can have. And that's okay. If you have a limited number of species, it means that you're going to have a set list or number of species that will be visiting your garden, but you're still servicing a number of species. Choose cultivars very carefully. So there is a big debate, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, between native plants, straight species native plants, which is like taking the seeds out of the prairie, putting them into a planter, and growing those seeds out. That is the straight species. Nativars are a situation where I take those seeds out of the prairie. I take those 10,000 seeds, I put them into a field, and I say, oh, that one's pretty. I'll bet I could propagate that one. And that is now a nativar because I've taken it out, I've selected it, I've named it, and now I am propagating it clonally, most likely by tissue culture in a lab, and selling it. So that is a nativar. And then a cultivar is, I am taking these 2 plants, I am crossing their pollen back and forth between the 2, and now I have a new plant. I have 10,000 plants, but I'm going to pick from those 10,000 plants the one cross that I really, really like. I'm going to select it, name it, and start propagating it clonally by tissue culture and selling it. So cultivars are human-made, varieties and nativars are nature-made. So avoid plants that are sterile and they have no pollen or nectar. Believe it or not, if you look at a catalog and you're looking for sunflowers, you will find sunflowers that have been bred for the floral industry that have no pollen. So pay attention to that if you're looking sort of at, if you're looking at like a more professional catalog of plants like Johnny's Seeds, which has a lot of flower seeds in there for flower farmers for the floral industry. And if it says it has no pollen, that is not a sunflower that you want for your garden, because the whole point of having it in your garden is to have pollen for the bees because they need it. So pay attention to that. Dwarf plants should be relatively acceptable, but again, if you're looking for sunflowers, that is one plant that I have definitely seen the no pollen tag on. I haven't seen that tag on very many other plants. And then if you are choosing or looking at nativars where the flower changes color during its process of blooming, like there's a lot of roses that do that, they change color. If the leaves change color or are a different color than the native, that might throw bees off and butterflies. Because remember, they have evolved with the straight species of plant. So when we start choosing them and naming the varieties, it's going to be for a couple of reasons that's coming up. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But those reasons why we are choosing those plants, because guess what? Those attributes are pleasing to us. It can throw them off and they might not be able to feed from that plant because they might not recognize it. So it's definitely something to think about. So you can put cultivars and nativars into your garden, just choose very carefully. Or experiment. If you have a garden already, this year, spend more time out in your garden on really nice, hot, sunny days, and sit for 10 or 20 minutes if you have the time. Count how many bees are traveling and feeding off of your cultivated plants. And if you see that they are or they aren't, spending a little bit of time feeding on your flowers, that might help you choose where to go in your plant choices and which plants to take out of your garden too. Protecting pollinators, you want to avoid pesticides at all costs. If you are still using your pesticides in your garden, this is the time right now to decide that pollinators are more important than pesticides. And if you stop using pesticides, you'll also be protecting your own health. I was a pesticide applicator for 16 years, licensed in the state of Illinois. I used pesticides and herbicides in my job. It was a tool in my job that I needed because I had limited staff. So it really was a tool that I had to have. But now that I'm out of that industry, I will never touch pesticides ever again. I have rarely used herbicides at my home. I've never used pesticides at my house. And I think I used it once. I used like slug powder, and it scared the bejesus out of me because I was breathing it in, or at least I thought I was. And I vowed I would never use that kind of thing in my garden at home anymore. Besides that, my garden is devoted to insects. Why would I do that? Even slugs? And so if you're still using pesticides, you really need to ask yourself why. What is it about whatever the insects are doing in your garden that offends you so much that you have to kill the insect instead of planting and inviting in beneficial insects that will eat that bad insect? So that's just a different way to think about it. So don't be offended by what I said. Just try and think about it in the opposite way. You want to make healthy soil. So composting and spreading compost in your garden, not tilling it in, just spreading it is really important. Using organic mulch so it can decay in your garden, builds good, healthy soil, also attracts a lot of worms. And then limit predators. And so one predator that is really detrimental to butterflies and small bees is the yellow jacket. And this photo inset is showing a product called the Waspinator. And no, they don't pay me to talk about their product. However, I've used their product for like 10 years, and it really is amazing. Using this wasp deterrent device in my garden has reduced the number of yellow jackets in my yard by about 90%. I used to see tons of them every day, all day long, like, a couple of dozen, because I had a nest somewhere on my property. And I started putting this out, took a couple of years, but they really disappeared. And the reason why this thing works is because that looks like a bald-faced hornet nest. And they are the natural enemy of the yellow jacket. And so if you have this hanging, you have one hanging by your garage, you have one hanging by your side of your house, you have a couple around your property. If your property is like medium to large size, then they will recognize that. They will see that it's a bald-faced hornet nest. Bald-faced hornets will not nest in this thing, by the way, but they will see that and they will get scared and they will go elsewhere. And I had my doubts whether or not it would really work, but it really does. And we used them at work. We had day camp that would spend the whole day outside. God knows why they did that to those kids, but they did. The kids spent the whole day outside. So they were eating lunch outside. And so that's kind of hazardous with yellow jackets, especially in August. And so we started hanging these around where the kids were going to be at day camp, and it helped a lot. And we did it at the pools too. We put them out at the pools where we had concessions, and it helped a lot less stings. Not all flowers are created equally. So flowers contain nectar and pollen. Nectar is the carbohydrate that gives energy. Pollen is the protein that helps build healthy babies. So they bees feed pollen to their larvae, their little baby bees. Pollinators go out and forage for nectar and drink nectar, and they're storing it and bringing it back to their nest, or they're just drinking it for themselves, they are also carrying pollen back to their nest and to other flowers, which makes them a pollinator. Some plants produce only pollen. So there's weird things like St. John's wort and the native plant shooting star. There's no nectar, there is only pollen. And then wild roses have no nectar, but lots of pollen. So there is some weirdness out there in the plant world. Not everything is black and white in the plant world. Believe me, there's so many exceptions to the rules. So just keep this in mind, that there's weird things like this, and things like the sunflowers that are bred not to have pollen. You know, pay attention when you're reading catalogs. So nativars, let's just define this. They are named varieties of native plants that someone has selected. And the reason why plants are selected to be nativars are because of flower color, flower size, color foliage, the total plant size. Usually compact is the big desirable thing. Instead of having a 6 or 7 or 8 foot tall ironweed, I can plant iron butterfly. It's 2 feet tall. It's a little ball. It's absolutely delightful. Whether or not it actually feeds a lot of pollinators, the jury is out on that. I have an iron butterfly ironweed in my garden, and I'm going to do some observations this year. I just thought about this today while I was preparing for this, that I don't know whether or not iron butterfly actually feeds any pollinators. So, you know, there's a lot of researchers that are out there just starting to do this research. And it is very important research, because the jury really is out. Should we be planting nativars? Should we not? There are very, very strict native plant people out there that say nothing but straight species should ever be planted anywhere in the world. They're very, very strict. And then there are people like me who feel that a healthy mixture of both is healthy, that it's not a problem. As long as the majority of your plants are native, then you are feeding who is coming to your garden. And if they are getting anything off of the other plants, then that's a bonus. Another reason for plants to be natives to be changed into nativars is disease resistance. There's a lot of native plants out there that get powdery mildew and other things, and it's just natural. It's part of their life cycle. It's just part of their condition, a genetic condition. And then if they come across one that has good disease resistance, they're going to use that. The plant researchers and plant breeders are going to use that to their advantage. Concern is whether or not these plants, as they are changed over to be nativars, chosen to be a nativar, continuously generation after generation cloned, are they retaining the nutrition in their pollen and their nectar? So again, the jury is out about it. There's a lot of concern in the plant world about it, and people are researching it. So I'm just going to read the bottom part of this slide because I think it's really important. This is a quote by Doug Tallamy. He is by far the reluctant leader of this sort of movement. If you've never read any of Doug Tallamy's books, he is extremely easy to read. He has videos on YouTube. He is amazing to listen to, and he will really change your mind about what it is to plant plants and the impact that we have when we plant plants. What is the impact in our neighborhood? You know, be the lily pad, don't be the desert island. So this quote came from an article that I read by him. With the popularity of nativars, it's plain to see that the nursery trade is still stuck on the idea of plants as enhanced decoration rather than essential to wildlife. And that is very true for the nursery industry. They're getting better, but instead of switching over to native plants, because for whatever reason, they don't like it, they don't see the value in them, they don't serve the purpose in a formal landscape as other plants do, they are not paying attention to the detriment that they might be doing to the environment. And so they continue on, and instead of selling native plants, they are selling nativars, which are a little bit more, fit a little bit better into a formal landscape. Let's just say that. So how much native plants do you need in a garden to be successful? It should be 80 to 60%. 80 is really, really good. 60 is pretty good. And I'd say that my garden is probably 60% but it's moving farther and farther over. There's a lot of things that I'm going to do this year. This year, I finally have time this summer that I can actually get out there and make some changes that I really want to make. But I'm still going to keep my peonies because they're sentimental, and I'm still going to keep, you know, a couple of nativars that I have so I can observe them. And what else am I going to keep? I'm still going to plant my annuals because my annuals get a lot of action from pollinators on it. And I like that. I like being able to watch them. So let's talk about some compact plant choices. Don't forget to put questions down in the chat so that we can have a conversation at the end. So some of these are natives and some are definitely nativars. In fact, a lot of the plants on this list is nativars. When you get the handout from me, it's going to have more natives put on it. I made up a little bit list. I'm going to talk about this list at the end of some extra plants to put on this list to take the nativars out. But in the meantime, I want you to be able to see what's out there as choice for compact native plants and nativars, because some of them they're good plants. They're not terrible. They're not the best, but they're not terrible. So let's talk about spring bloomers. Remember when I said earlier that you want to try to have at least 3 species blooming during each section of the season. So we have spring, we have early summer, mid to late summer, and then sort of fall. It's that late part of the year is just kind of it's kind of melds together, I guess I can say that. So as far as the natives go for spring bloomers, there's a lot of things like Spring Beauty is a beautiful little flower. And I know I don't have pictures of everything here, but you will be able to look these guys up. You know, take pictures of the slides if you want to. You're free to do that because the names of all the plants we're going to talk about tonight are on the slides. And then I'm going to make sure that's in the handout, and I'm going to give you a couple of extra plants. So as far as spring goes, Spring Beauty is a really pretty little plant. Think like a native crocus. It looks a little bit like a crocus. Virginia bluebells are gorgeous in the springtime. They feed bees. Wild geranium is very popular with bees. Pecera obovata, which is roundleaf groundsel. That is the top picture. So if you have an area that gets moist soil, it kind of stays moist all summer long, then this is a good ground cover for that area. It's going to be, I'm not going to say it's going to be an invasive ground cover because we don't use that word when we're referring to native plants, but it does spread pretty good and it makes a good ground cover, and not a lot can grow through this ground cover. It's pretty thick. And then, and it's a very low ground cover, and it's just, you know, kind of like a coin-sized leaf. It's just a green ground cover, but it has this really beautiful little 18-inch tall stems with tiny, tiny little yellow daisies. And it's a very popular bee plant early in the spring. So those are just opening in my garden in the spot that I have. And now that the weather is going to warm up this weekend and next week, then we're going to have, I'll see more bees on it this week. Wood violets. Down on the bottom, those are wood violets. Those are the violets that are probably in everybody's lawn right now, or in your garden or in your landscaping, and you're thinking about pulling them out. Think about not doing that, because it is a host plant for some tiny little butterflies. It is an important native plant. It is a native plant. It's not really well known that this is a native plant. I did not know that wood violets were natives until just a few years ago. There's a couple of different colors of wood violets. There's sort of a white, the purple, and then kind of a lavender striped one. So there is a little bit of variety in there. There's also other violets like Labrador violets and a few other varieties that are native. These, I think, are the toughest, strongest ones out there. And if you already have them in your yard, start encouraging them to grow as a ground cover somewhere in your yard, because they will grow very well as a ground cover, and it will be a nice thick ground cover, and not a lot can get through it. So it's not a bad plant. There was another one. Phlox divaricata. I always have a hard time with that name. Phlox divaricata is the blue wood phlox, blooming right now, along with the roundleaf groundsel. And it's a light blue flower, and it's a very fragrant phlox. This is the native phlox that blooms at the same time as creeping phlox, which has been a wildly popular spring plant in garden centers for years. That's not a native, and it kind of blooms really for a short period of time. And I really don't like the foliage of creeping phlox. I like the blue wood phlox much better. It can grow in sun, it can grow in shade, it makes a nice colony. It's not an aggressive spreader, it doesn't reseed, and it blooms for, you know, like a month or a little bit more than a month. And it's fragrant. I really like that it's fragrant. So that's Phlox divaricata, and that name will be on your handout. Okay, so I just wanted to add one more to the spring list. And then as far as non-natives for spring, you can go ahead and add things like allium. You can add the small allium like that is in this picture. That's the summerish blooming, late spring, summer allium. But allium like Globemaster and Gladiator are like 3 feet tall. They're big and they have a giant purple flower. And those are really popular with bees. I see my bees on those plants all the time, and my plants make seeds every year. So they are very healthy plants. And I think it's incredible they make seeds because you don't expect that from a bulb plant. Crocus are okay for bees. Daffodils are okay for bees. Snowdrops, summer snowflake is okay. I've seen some bees on that. Wood anemones. So those are all good to add in, but if you're going to add in spring things, add in some natives also. If you're going to put bulbs in, add the natives also. All right, compact pollinator plants for monarchs. So I would say that if you are tight on space, these are probably the 3 best that are going to be shorter, compact, non-spreading. So on the right-hand side, we have Asclepias sullivantii. That is prairie milkweed. And prairie milkweed does everything for the pollinators and for monarchs that common milkweed does, but it's shorter and it does not spread as fast. Now, common milkweed everybody says it's aggressive, it's invasive, blah, blah, blah. You know what? Yeah, it spreads. It likes to spread. My theory is that it uses up all of the nutrients in an area, and it has to keep moving on to find nutrients. Doesn't mean that we should fertilize it. We should never fertilize it. But what it means is that it's going to spread around. But just like every other plant, common milkweed has a lifespan. It's about 7 to 9 years. So it's going to spread. It's going to move around, and then it's going to start shrinking. So it's not a forever plant. It doesn't just spread forever. It just doesn't. So the second one there is with the orange flowers. You can see that there's some variety to this. There's like orange and there's sort of gold, and then there's kind of a red orange in the back. That's Asclepias tuberosa. And that variation in the flower colors is very normal when you're planting the straight species. There's a lot of variety in that orange color. What else can I say about this plant? You're not going to get a lot of caterpillars on this plant, but you will get some. The butterflies absolutely adore this plant for the nectar. It's popular with hummingbirds. It's popular with bees, popular with monarchs. Now, Asclepias verticillata, which is the world milkweed, the one down on the bottom on the left, or on the right, the white one, that one likes moist conditions. So again, if you have a spot that is sunny and it's kind of moist, maybe next to a drainage ditch in the front of your house, if you have a neighborhood that's like that, has an open drainage ditch, if you have a downspout somewhere out in the sun that you just can't get to dry out, those kind of situations, this is a good plant for that, because then it'll spread until the moisture runs out. So it'll tell you where the moisture stops. And you will get caterpillars and eggs on this because, and it's a tiny little plant. It's only about 12 inches tall. Those leaves are as fine as you can possibly get in a leaf and still photosynthesize. They're tiny little leaves, yet I have seen big fat caterpillars on it. So it's an interesting little plant. So those are compact. And then you can also plant swamp milkweed, but when I'm thinking about plants for small spaces, I'm thinking about short also, not just not wide. And so that's why I left swamp milkweed off of this list. However, if you have a little bit of extra space, you can plant your swamp milkweed, because swamp milkweed will get 4 to 5 feet tall. if you water it a lot. So some other compact natives we have over on the left-hand side, Ruellia humilis. This is the wild petunia. It's a beautiful little plant that blooms it grows in a mound. It's only about 18 to 20 inches tall. It grows into a really thick mound, and there is no weed that can penetrate that mound. It's a fantastic plant. I had one at work that I collected seeds off of for about 12 years before I left my job. And there was Canadian thistle in the bed where this thing lived, and the Canadian thistle never made it through this plant. It grew around it. It never made it through it. So it's a good plant to fight the weeds, to really shade the soil and be thick and not let weeds through. It takes a little while for this plant to get big and bold and round and mature. In the middle, we have Verbena stricta, that's hoary vervain. This is one of the shorter vervain plants that are native. There's one that's taller, that's hastata, but it's short and stocky, so it's really nice for a small garden. And then Dahlia purpurea. If you are standing in front of a native plant sale and they have Dahlia purpurea there, purple prairie clover, don't pick one up, don't pick 3 up. Pick up 5 to 6, because it's such a small, demure, slim plant that you need to plant a big clump like this so you can actually notice the plant. Now, whether or not you have 1 or 6 or 7, the bees are still going to find the flowers. But for your aesthetic, you want to have more so that you can actually see it, so you know where it is, so you can enjoy it, and so it can make you happy, because it just, you know what, I just love this plant because it's just a really happy little adorable plant. And plants can be happy little adorable things. All right, other compact pollinators. Now we're getting into the world of nativars. And again, you know, before we start talking about nativars, let me talk to you really briefly about these other ones on my list. There are a lot of asters in the plant world and in the native world and in the cultivar world, but there are a lot of them grow really big, unless you buy a nativar or a cultivar. Then they're kind of small and tight, which is like, coincidentally, this one in the middle here is purple dome. It is a nativar of New England aster. But one other aster that I think might work for small gardens, that's only 2 foot tall and about 3 foot wide, so you got to give it some space, but it's going to stay low, is aromatic aster, and that is Symphotrichum oblongifolium. So that's kind of a new one to me. In fact, but I think I've had aromatic aster in my garden before. So if you just go by aromatic aster, you'll be able to find it, and you're going to find it in native plant sale. It has sky blue flowers. It's the straight species. Another plant that is a native that is suitable for sandy soils would be Gaillardia. Now, the only thing that I want you to think about with Gaillardia is that if you live up in the dunes, do not plant Gaillardia. Gaillardia down in North Carolina has escaped onto the Outer Banks, and the Outer Banks is just absolutely lousy with Gaillardia because it loves the sand, and it's not totally native there. And I don't like, we are in the Gaillardia native zone, like region, but I have never seen it up in the Indiana dunes, in the National Lake Shore or the state park or anywhere else. So I'd say if you live up in the dunes, don't plant Indian blanket. But if you live anywhere else where you kind of have sandy soil, it's okay to plant, I think. I would hate for this to escape in the dunes and be the person responsible for it. Lobelia syphilitica, which is great blue lobelia, is a tall, slim plant. And those are okay for small spaces, 2 to 4 feet tall and slim, like less than a foot. And then blue mist flower, which is, I'm not even going to try and tell you the name. There's only one blue mist flower out there. Blue mist flower is the perennial ageratum. So if you've been around native plants before, you know what I'm talking about. It's got puffs of blue flowers at the end of the season, and it's wildly popular with pollinators. It's a native. It's kind of a spready plant, but it's not a big deal. Like if it shows up somewhere where you don't want it, you just pull it out. It doesn't have roots that are going to stay in there and, you know, break off and you're going to get more of it. It's not like that at all. So blue mist flower grows 1 to 3 feet. If it's in the shade, it's shorter. If it's in the sun, it's a little taller. And like I said, it spreads around a little bit. I have it in a couple of new places where I didn't put it, and it's okay where it reseeded. It's going to stay where it is. And then blue phlox. Okay, so those are the extra plants that I'm going to put on your list. There are a lot of cultivars, man-made cultivars, and there are a lot of nativars out there of Echinacea, which is purple coneflower. One of the old-fashioned types of Echinacea cultivar that I like is Kim's Knee High. It's really small and compact, and it's a really long-lived plant, and it does get some pollinator action, but it's nice and compact. Purple dome, sorry, New England aster, very good for pollinators. I see lots of bees on it every year. I do have it in my garden, just for the observation part of it, because it's kind of in a weird space, but the insects still find it, still feed off of it. Black adder, Anise hyssop. Anise hyssop, the straight species, is not real colorful. This one has better color on the flowers, but again, I caution you with a different color than what the insects are accustomed to might throw them off. So this is one of those plants I would say try one out, observe it, see what the insects do with it, and then plant more if they find it and they like it. Some other things that are out there that are compact, pardon my purple Monarda. Monarda that is so closely planted, like this Monarda is with other plants, is problematic because it will get powdery mildew. So just keep that in mind. It needs a good air circulation. Snowcap Shasta daisy is probably one of the most compact Shasta daisies. And I think Becky is an even better one to use as a ground cover because nothing can grow through that plant. Once Becky, Shasta daisy, and Snowcap are fully mature, and they're very, very thick when they're fully mature, you could plant 10 of them together and have a ground cover, and there's not very many weeds that could make it through that. So it's good, tough, thick plants. And baby Joe pieweed is a probably a nativar of our purple spotted Echinacea maculata, and it's only about 2.5 feet tall. And I have had good success with this plant being really reliable with pollinators. We had it at work in one of our gardens, in one of our butterfly gardens. Some other ones, Walker's Low Catmint. This plant is not native, but it is wildly popular with bees, as is the white plant down here on the left-hand side. That's Calamentha, white cloud. I have experience with both of these plants in my garden and wildly popular with bees, native bees, honeybees, bumblebees, like everything that you can think of that's going to visit is going to go to those two plants. And they bloom for a really, really long time during the season. So they do a lot of feeding to the pollinators. So they are not native, but they're not bad. So, and lavender also very, very popular with bees. It falls in the category of herbs, and pretty much all herbs are very popular with honeybees. So if you have someone who has honeybees in the neighborhood, they will be happy with that. Some other ones that are cultivars, nativars, I mean, Black-Eyed Susan this one is Viet's Little Susie, which is my favorite Black-Eyed Susan cultivar or nativar, whatever it is. I'm not sure what it is, but Viet's Little Susie is really compact. It's really hardy. I don't think it reseeds like Goldstrom does. Goldstrom is an old-fashioned variety that's been overplanted and is now plagued with all different kinds of diseases. So it's not really recommended at all. If you have Goldstrom in your garden, I would say get it out of your garden and plant something else. Plant this goldenrod, or not goldenrod, but Black-Eyed Susan, or plant the straight species, which is Rudbeckia hirta, which is only 3 feet tall. So it's not a very big plant. It's 2 to 3 feet tall, and it's 1 to 2 feet wide. Oh, good, I typed that in there for you. Next to it, again, is Asclepias tuberosa. That's butterfly weed, straight species always. Don't bother with Hello Yellow. Don't bother with the other cultivars or the other nativars of butterfly weed because they do not live very long. This plant grows by a very, very large taproot, and they can live 10 to 12 years. They can live a really, really long lifespan, but for some reason, Hello Yellow just can't make it through our wet winters. It's not happy. And I've never been able to have Hello Yellow live more than maybe 2 winters, and then we get a bad winter and it kind of bites it. So I don't think it's the cold. I really do think it's the moisture, because if you do not have perfect drainage for this plant, it won't make it in your garden at all. So keep that in mind. And then over on the right-hand side is Cobalt Blazing Star, which is the blazing star that you see in every garden center that carries blazing star. It got goldenrod on the brain. So Cobalt Blazing Star is just a shorter version of our native blazing star, which is Liatris speciosa. It's one of the 12 species of Liatris that are native to our region. Here's my spiel about Liatris. Cobalt is great. It's the first one to bloom. It's about 2 feet tall, blooms for about 2 weeks. Now, if you go to a native plant sale, if you have the space, add 2 or 3 other species of Liatris that bloom a little bit later on in the season, because then you don't have blazing star for just 2 weeks, you have blazing star for about 6 to 9 weeks. And they bloom, the last 2 bloom straight into the middle of October. And they're really beautiful. They're very tall, slim plants. So as long as your garden can handle something very tall, you can plant Liatris speciosa, Liatris ligulostylus, and Liatris scariosa variety Newlandii, which is a native. Variety Newlandii is not considered a nativar. It's just a variety of a native. And I have to probably look up and see what that really means. But as far as I've been told, it is a native. So some compact annuals for pollinators, because like I said before, I really do think that the annuals are kind of important, especially if you've had a butterfly garden for a while and there just aren't any butterflies visiting your garden and you're frustrated. Add some dwarf zinnias, add some big zinnias. If you need a dwarf Mexican sunflower, because the regular Mexican sunflower torch is like 5 to 7 feet tall, Fiesta del Sol is only 2 to 3 feet tall. It's very compact, still gets tons of flowers, lots and lots of butterflies feed off of it. And dwarf sunflowers, again, make sure that it's not the no pollinator type. And then there's a lot of other different kinds of dwarf, small, compact annuals out there that are good for pollinators. I will add some to our plant list that you are going to get. But pretty much what I want you to think about when you go to add annuals is, are you going to plant them in a pot or the ground? If you're going to plant them in a pot, maybe only 2 or 3 plants in a pot instead of stuffing a planter like you see in the catalogs and you see in garden centers and stuff like that. Because the flowers have to be able to be gotten to by the pollinators. And if you really, really stuff a planter tight, I have noticed that if it's too tight, they have a really hard time getting to the plants that are low. If you're putting them in the ground, decide how much space you want to fill and read the tags when you go look for plants at the garden centers. Keep one thing in mind about garden centers, and please do visit independent garden centers. It's very important that independent garden centers stay alive in our culture and in our society. I think there's a great need for good education, good plant knowledge, and the local independent garden centers are that place for our communities. So pretty much every independent garden center is going to have similar plants at them, but they will also have plants that they buy every year that are like their favorites, their best sellers, and it's going to be different for each one. So visit more than one at least this year. I've already been to 4. I've been to 4 already this year. So I love going to the garden center. It's fun. Okay, a couple of other compact annuals for your pollinator gardening. Sweet Alyssum, it's great. Sweet Alyssum is really pretty in a pot. It's really pretty on the ground. You can kind of use it as a little ground cover. It will reseed itself. You'll have Alyssum forever, and you will have very, very happy bees forever. Gem marigolds are the marigolds in the center picture. It's a very, very specific type of marigold. They're a little hard to find. I find them very difficult to grow from seed, so I don't know if you should bother. I mean, I'm even winter sowing them and they don't like it, and they didn't like it in the greenhouse, and they're just difficult to germinate for some reason. But you can find them in some garden centers, and if you can't find it, ask for it. It's a really old-fashioned type of marigold. And so this marigold has more of the chemical in it that makes it a marigold, makes it smelly like a marigold. And so this would be the marigold you would want in your vegetable garden to fight back against nematodes. Okay. This is a really good one for pollinators that are very, very small, because each one of those flowers is only about the size of a dime. They're very tiny, but I love this plant because the flowers are so tiny and the plants are really small. They're only like 12 inches wide by about 8 inches tall. It's a really great little plant. And then the plant on the the right-hand side is borage, which is a fantastic herb that has edible flowers, but I usually just leave the flowers for the bees. 3 compact shrubs for pollinators that are nativars that I think are still worthy enough to plant. Magical Moonlight Buttonbush is on the left. It's a small compact version of a plant that usually gets about 8 feet tall. So this one's only about 3 feet. They get round white balls of flowers, and they're kind of fragrant. Very, very popular with bees. Little Henry Sweetspire, the Itea in the center there. That's the fall color. It has white spikes of flowers in the summer, and it is a hummingbird magnet. And then Sapphire Surf Bluebeard is the Caryopteris on the right-hand side. And any cultivar of Caryopteris, even though it's not a native plant, any one of the cultivars that are out there on the out in the garden centers is going to be popular for bees at the end of the season. Bluebeard blooms in September, and it's really, really a good plant. Some plants to think about that bloom in October for the migration. You need goldenrod. Those are the 2 yellow plants in here. You need New England aster down on the bottom left. Swamp milkweed is still sort of blooming through September. Autumn joy sedum, even though it's not a native, wildly popular with pollinators at the end of the season. And then over on the right-hand side is Liatris ligulostylus. And that is the liatris that blooms during the monarch migration. And so the monarchs are looking for the liatris, but they are following the goldenrod and the New England aster bloom from Canada down through the states into Texas and to the border of Mexico. They follow that bloom line all the way down. That's one of their triggers for the migration. So if you have not thought about planting things for the monarchs, and you want to, and you think the only thing you need is to add milkweed to your garden, I really encourage you to start thinking about planting things that are going to bloom for that fall migration, because that is one time of the year where the monarch butterflies are really lacking food. They really need, they need native plants at the end of the season. Herbs for bees, we have basil, oregano. In the middle there is a different kind of bluebeard. Let's see, catmint again, crocus, there's obedient plant, zinnias, sunflowers. That sunflower has a honeybee on it. And then maintenance I want to go over really quickly. So I told you that I was going to tell you about the signs of an ecosystem. In my garden, I started noticing after about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years that I had lots of really different weird insects, and I didn't know what some of them were, and I looked them up. And one of them was a ladybug larva, and it's a little whitish, pinkish, segmented little worm in the soil. They live in the soil for 2 years, and I have them all over my garden. Every time I dig in my garden, I unearth one and put them right back. Or I'm digging up my garden in the spring and I unearth a bumblebee, or I'm digging in my garden and I unearth a toad. There's a lot of life in my garden that I didn't even know about until I started paying attention. The first time I ever saw a ladybug larva, I almost cried because I had been told for years that ladybugs don't lay eggs in people's gardens. Nobody knew where they laid eggs. They obviously laid eggs in organic gardens. And I almost cried when I found one in my garden because I thought, well, the ladybugs are actually staying in my garden instead of flying away. So I was really delighted about that. So that's what I mean as signs of an ecosystem. You're actually going to see the critters in your garden, whether it be a toad or a garter snake, maybe chipmunks, which, you know, you might not want the chipmunks, but they might be there. And then all the different insect life and hummingbirds and then songbirds, if you add more and more native trees. If you're interested in the native tree thing and attracting songbirds, I really do encourage you to look up Doug Talame because that is his specialty. I won't go into it tonight because we're running out of time. You have a pollinator garden. Now, how do you maintain it? You maintain it, first of all, by being really meticulous about weeding and not so meticulous about putting down deep mulch. I haven't really put down a lot of mulch in my garden for about the last 6 or 7 years, mostly because I've had my knees replaced and I just really couldn't do it. But so it was kind of a can't thing, not want thing. But I benefited by seeing more and more bumblebees making nests and other bees making nests in my garden and things like that. But Mother Nature does not like being naked. So you have to cover the soil with something. So what I do is I plant my plants tighter. I allow certain ground covers to grow in my garden through my plants. I even have Creeping Charlie in my garden. I don't really like it, but the Creeping Charlie is in there and it covers the soil. Bare soil is important, but you don't want all of it bare. Deep mulch is bad for pollinators though. They can't dig through it to make their nests. You can switch to bigger mulch like pine bark mulch, which that is my preferred mulch. Unfortunately, you can only get it in bags. You cannot get it by the truckload. So I promised to show you what it looks like when native bees make a nest in a stem. So if you look at this little photo from the University of Minnesota over on the left-hand side of your screen, that is a stem of some kind of flower. Let's just pretend it's a purple coneflower because that's a really, really common plant for bees to nest in. And there is food in the form of pollen. There's 2 little nuggets of it. You can see that it's pointing to it. And then building material. This is a leaf cutter bee. And the mother bee has cut leaves off of plants. And with that and her spit, she has made plugs to put in between her little nesting spots. And then she lays an egg right on the pollen ball. And then, so she'll put pollen in. She'll collect pollen, put pollen in a little cell in the stem, and then she will put an egg on it, and then she plugs the stem with the plant material, and then she goes off and collects more pollen, brings it back, and puts it in the next section of the stem. So they're coming down the stem from the tip of the stem. Sometimes they drill into the side of a stem and go down, but they're going to hollow out that stem, and by putting in the little bits of plant material or mud, they are making the cells in the stem. And for some bees, what they do is they put a female on the bottom. They will lay an egg for a female first, and she will wake up first and pupate first, and then be the adult bee sitting in her cell. And she's kind of mad because she can't get out and feed. So she starts kicking, and it wakes up the male bees that have been put in cells above her, and it makes them come out of their pupation, out of their basically their cocoon, and then they all dig themselves out, and then they mate and go on their merry way. So there's just a couple of bees that do that, but I think it's kind of interesting that has happened. That forethought is there. There's a couple of other pictures of how they plug the top of a stem in the center picture there on the right, and then what it looks like inside of a stem on the far right hand side up at the top. And that's another leafcutter bee. So in total, I think I've seen about 10 different species of bees in my garden, plus bumblebees. I've seen probably about 10 different varieties of butterfly, including one rare butterfly, and I've seen them twice. So But what do you do with the garden at the end of the season, in the spring, over the winter? This little chart is going to be one of your handouts. You are going to get the complete handout from the University of Minnesota with this cutting chart and directions on how to maintain a proper pollinator garden. No more are we supposed to cut down the garden to the ground. Our garden, and it's going to look messy, but our garden should be cut off where the plants are cut off at about 12 to 18 inches, because the bees make their nests in the dead stems, and some of them do it from the stems from last year. So if we are taking that dead plant material completely away, we are taking away opportunities for the bees to nest. So I did this last year. I took the tops off of all of my plants and I laid the stems down in the garden, just like it shows in the little diagram. And that became some of my mulch. So that's the spring picture here. And then it tells you what's going on inside the stems as far as the bees go. In summertime, the stems that are left up from last year are hidden. And then when we get to fall and winter, everything is dried up. And then when the stems just rot at the bottom, the stems are going to fall off the plant naturally. So like I said earlier, it is a little bit messier looking garden, but it's a lot more natural. It is a garden for them instead of for us. So it's something to think about. And this is what it looks like when a mason bee digs down into a stem. She's getting ready to make a nest. I'm sure those little blue mason bees are familiar to some of you. So leave the leaves and create soft landings. This is another subject that you can go on and do more reading about. Soft landings is where you have areas under trees that are not lawn, and they are not only mulch. They are planted, and you leave the leaves over the winter, you leave the leaves in the spring, and that is a habitat for insects to overwinter, and it's a safe habitat for them to overwinter. So it's called a soft landing. So you can find out more information about this on the, oh, where did I put the website? I know I put it in here. I think it's pollinatornatives.com. I'll make sure it's in your handout. There's a lot of information about this on that website. It's from Heather Holmes. She's a bee expert out in the world. So just something to think about. Something to think about. This is a little video of one of my gardens at work. I hope you guys can all see this. There was a little teeny tiny fragment of the migration that came through a couple years ago, and my coworker and I managed to catch it. And the next day this was a day where it was about 65, 68 degrees and sunny, kind of how it was today. But this was in September. The next day it was cloudy and it was a little bit colder and it was a little rainy, and all those butterflies were gone. They took off in the morning. So it was really beautiful. There was probably about 20 or 25 monarchs. There were sulfurs, there were black swallowtails. There was a whole bunch of butterflies there. Okay, some final thoughts. Don't think that you can't make a garden in a small space, because all you have to do is just be a little organized, be creative. You can do it. It's not undoable. Even if you live in a condo and just have a small patio, you can plant a swamp milkweed and some zinnias and a couple of other things in some big pots, and you will see pollinators. They will come. If you plant it, they will come. Do a little bit at a time. Don't stress out about this. If you're thinking about completely converting your whole landscape, do it a little bit at a time. Don't do it all at one time. First of all, it might be kind of hard to budget for that. Second of all, you might want to grow some stuff from seeds, so you're going to need things for next year, time to prep, things like that. And if you already have a garden going and you're just going to tweak it this year, make sure you go out and take some observations. Don't just have that pollinator garden. Go out and spend time in that pollinator garden. Observe how the bees are acting. Observe the butterflies' behaviors and how they do things and what they are going to. And when a monarch butterfly flies into your garden, where are they going first? The annuals or the milkweed? Things like that. Really get out there and have some experiences with your garden. Don't just have it, be part of it, be part of what's going on out there. Talk about your garden to your neighbors, because your garden might be a little messy looking, just like what that picture is that I showed you. It's a little messier. It's not tailored. It is not formal looking. This is, you know, kind of a big, fluffy, messy garden. That's sort of how I describe mine. And I do talk to my neighbors about my garden. There is only me and one other person in my whole neighborhood, which is 3 blocks by 3 blocks, that actually have big gardens. There are only 2 of us. And we do talk to our neighbors that walk up and down the street, and, you know, they're walking their dogs and stuff. And, you know, I engage with them. I say hello to everybody. And, you know, and that might prompt them to say, oh, what a beautiful garden. And I'll tell them it's a pollinator garden. There's lots of butterflies. You'll see lots of things out here, and, you know, come and observe and invite them in, and, you know, make them understand what it is and why it's important. And that might get them to think about why it might be important for their garden, and they might start a garden too. So, but be patient and be gentle to garden, be gentle to earth, be gentle to yourself. Don't work too hard. And let's do some questions here before we really run terribly over time, which I think I've already have. So Leslie, we have any questions?
No questions yet, but there is a comment on there about a variety of sunflower that does not produce pollen, and to watch out for those referred to as pro-cut.
Ah, pro-cut, that's the term. Thank you. That is good to know. What's the difference of an English garden and a pollinator garden? I would say the difference between an English garden and a pollinator garden is that an English garden does not concentrate on native plants for the pollinators. An English garden just puts out plants for the bees and for butterflies, but they're not necessarily native to England or the UK, or, you know, wherever this garden is being planted. It's really like a style of garden, which looks a lot like a pollinator garden. Like I think that if you came over and saw my garden this summer, you'd say it's kind of cottagey garden looking, because they're kind of big, fluffy, loose conglomerations of plants. And I think for us, the difference in the definition would be that we are concentrating on native plants for the bees.
Dolly, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on pollinator gardening.
You're welcome.